I look forward to this time of the year when we get into summer scopes of work and we really start talking about what do we do in the middle of summer. When we get into the heat, we start to enter August, there's got to be more than junipers. And this is when we get into some of these, I would say, slower growing. We talked about the hinoki maintenance pruning. We came back and we handled the eastern white cedar, Thuja occidentalis, earlier in the season. But we get into this moment where we have some of our slowest growing species that really do lend themselves to a conducive moment where we can go ahead and we can check the strength, we can redirect the energy, we can stop the strong from getting stronger, help the weak from getting weaker, and really start to balance out that energy in the system. And these kinds of more refinement-based prunings that are not removing heavy quantities of foliage, but are definitively continuing to transition hormones, distribute energy, and help the tree along in its process of refinement become a very significant scope of summer work, and we're going to dive into it today. Without further ado, let's rock and roll. Now I'm going to give you a 360 of this, and this is a tree that we've had at Mirai for a fairly long time, originally collected by Dan Robinson, and this is a western red cedar, Thuja plicata, which is very, very interesting. There are not many western red cedars that exist as bonsai subjects, but you can see how really interesting this trunk is. And there's some beautiful, beautiful interaction of live and dead here down at the very base. There's some wonderful twists up in the upper portion of the trunk. It truly is a very, very spectacular tree and a very special tree. But this tree's nuance, and much like we talked about with the eastern white cedar, and much like we talk about in terms of handling of hinoki, we want that lateral frond layout, but this tree's nuance has this drop of the branches that then have that kind of characteristic little sort of shoot out, almost like the offshoots or a byproduct of a firecracker, right? Just this little kind of falling graceful arch, a pendulous form. And you'll notice that all of the branches dropping. This is very much western red cedar, very Thuja kind of in nature in the Pacific Northwest in terms of how they naturally kind of acclimate and accommodate the opportunity with space. And if you were to come into a Thuja, and which happens a lot in the built environment in the Pacific Northwest, and you limbed up a Thuja so that you had all of this open space, that open space is only going to last for a few years before somehow, somewhere, even though it's a very slow growing tree, these branches find their way down into that space and you're right back in the same situation. Now, one of the things about the design of this tree, and this happens every single year depending on when you come to Mirai and when you see this tree, you'll notice that as it gets bigger and bigger and the strong get stronger and the weak get weaker, the proportions of the tree change dramatically, right? And all of a sudden the trunk looks super thin, the foliage looks super big, and we don't have that proportion that gives rise to the more delicate, spacious, airy Thuja plicata nature and aesthetic. And this is where we come back and we say, listen, this is a piece we've been working on for a long time. Definitively an opportunity to not try and overly manage the growth over the course of the year, but pick your moment. Pick your moment. It's a slow growing species. Pick your moment where you're going to come back and you're going to really start to have the capacity to transition that energy that exists inside of the tree. You're going to have the capacity to regain that lightness and that elegance. You're going to allow it to have a little bit of that phototropic rise, right? And then we're going to be pruning to directionally drive that growth, okay? And I'm just kind of starting in here. I have some really young shoots and really young pieces of foliar mass, and you see this where it's growing vertically. This is a new shoot. I have a little bit of a weaker piece here on the interior. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that piece off. I'm going to be looking at some of these younger shoots on the interior here and just touching them, just a little touch. So those all feel well attached, so I won't be actively pulling those off. Okay? But when I get into this situation and we talk about that sort of frond-like pendulous growth, I'm really looking at where is my transition point. And you'll notice it starts to give rise to and take on that oxen-filled verticality here. But there's a transition where we have a strong secondary growing frond that we can make that really beautiful, really seamless transition to in terms of the shape of the tree. And we start to take on, as we get warmed up and as we start to understand the nuances of the tree, its growth habit, where the aesthetic can go, we start to understand how far back we can prune. And I'm going to be fairly aggressive with this, okay? Now, when we talk about the pruning and I say, hey, listen, when we get into these pieces, I want to just be checking to see if any of these are brittle. I want to be very delicate with the way I handle these fronds because they are quite weakly attached at that junction point and do come off easily. But assuming that all of these pieces, the needles that exist off of this frond, are well attached, that means that they are portions that have the capacity at the tip of that frond and at the tip of that needle to be cut back in terms of that central spine and really have the capacity to now bifurcate, start to ramify, and start to grow. And that gives me a lot of artistic freedom in terms of the reduction of Thuja, because even when I get into something like this, where we're dealing with an offshoot of our central spine, okay, you'll start to see where it has these tertiary pieces that have these lighter green tips that are actively growing and actively capable of dividing. I could prune this tip back to here. I could prune this tip all the way back into here, or I could prune this tip all the way back into here. Now, we are going to leave behind, when we prune back this elongated growth, we are going to leave behind a browning on the margin from that cut. So we want to be strategic, and if we can avoid it, we want to avoid trying to overly handle this, right? We don't want to be trying to overly control it. Really be thinking about, where is that transition that allows me to reduce that mass? Where's the transition that allows me to guide that frond-like behavior? And as we just start to take action on some of these pieces of growth, we start to recognize, oh, wow, okay, so for as big as it's gotten, as robustly as it's grown, we do have the capacity to come back in and really seriously check the distribution of strength, the angle, the aesthetic presentation of branches, etc., and have a very positive impact on the shape of the tree and the way that the tree is growing. And again, when we talk about a real skyscraping giant, this western red cedar is one of the Thuja species that definitely gives rise to some of that really beautiful, what we would tend to call cedar, right? And in terms of lumber and rot-resistant lumber and high tannic content lumber, this is one of the major resources in North America for that really, really rot-resistant lumber. When you start to get into the older pieces, when you start to get into the more tannic-filled, high tannic content pieces, it really does have a preservative capacity, okay? Now again, when I get into these areas, I'm just checking, and you'll see some of these fronds that are a little bit expired back in here. It's losing its color, it's kind of lost a lot of its viability, and all of a sudden these little tertiary pieces just pull off without virtually any force. That is a branch that is now spent. And we really want to be starting to, when we think about the pruning process, we want to be starting to come back and address the strength and reallocate the strength and remove these weaker pieces before they naturally start to drop on their own. And they naturally start to drop on their own in the early fall. That's really when they've exhausted all sugar starch productivity for the production of foliar mass, and they start to make their own decisions. Now we lose control of where the tree allocates its energy. And you can see, just as I'm touching them, it's just a very, very delicate touch to be understanding of where we're at in terms of the maturity of that, knowing that we are cutting back to a viable piece that has the capacity to continue on is a really, again, an important part of the process, okay? And I'm just kind of feeling my way through this very first piece. I do have some branches in here that I would say are definitely weaker and of a lower quality, and this came up on the Hinoki stream as well, which is, well, what happens if you pinch? Can you pinch Thuja plicata? Can you pinch Thuja occidentalis? Can you pinch Chamaecyparis or the Hinoki? Yes, 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 you can. But do you want to? Okay, that's really the question, because we can pinch. It is an elongating species. The strength does exist in the vascular tissue, but when we talk about pinching, we understand that pinching takes away, it negates that delicate frond-like weeping kind of drooping habit that is really quintessential and characteristic of the species. And once we start to overly manage, pinch, and try to control, we increase density, and in the increase of density, we get balls of foliage. We get vertically growing pieces. Notice how in almost every piece that we're handling here, there is a naturally pendulous nature to the shape of the growth, the shape of the needle, the shape of the foliage. I didn't do this. I didn't come back and wire all of these into this position. This is what a Thuja plicata will do. This is the action that a Thuja plicata will form over the course of the season on its own. It's its natural growth habit to kind of generate this feeling and this type of growth generation, etc. And so if we pinch, we really kind of neutralize its ability and capacity to behave in the way that we would expect it to, and all of a sudden we start dealing with a lot more verticality, a lot more balls of foliage, a lot more uncontrollable, robust pieces of growth, okay? And one of the beautiful things when we start getting into this and having these really aggressive young shoots, there is, much like a juniper we see with crotch growth potentially becoming a higher quality, more interior dense, more highly ramified piece of growth, there is the opportunity over the course of time to take away some of these longer, leggier. And when you look at that, I mean, you really are talking about a very long and leggy piece of growth there. There's not much value to this. Even to try and prune this back, I'm not getting what I need on the interior here. So let's go ahead, and when we get these vigorous pieces, the dogma of bonsai is clean out crotches or clean out those aggressive interior pieces, push everything to the tip. That's how we kind of set ourselves up for an ever-expanding, ever-enlarging canopy over the course of our bonsai practice. To take advantage of this, just to take advantage of that interior really strong piece and try and utilize and continue to give ourselves the capacity to reduce, to push back, to hold that proportion that gives rise to value in the tree. This is really where we're strategizing and we're implementing technique and an understanding of the species for that future productivity or the future reduction of it to maintain proportion, value as a bonsai subject, etc. And this is ultimately, when we get into the refinement phase, we are already clear on the aesthetic. Okay, we're not necessarily saying that we've gotten to the best iteration of the tree, but we definitely have spent enough time over 3 or 4 workings or more, depending on where in the refinement process you are. We've definitely spent enough time to understand what it is we're accomplishing with this tree, where the merit of the aesthetic lies, and how we continue to kind of drive this forward. And this is where we do have the capacity to make these kinds of decisions. In that refinable branch to reduce that length, we can go ahead and create extremely educated decision-making on these moments where reduction really does regain proportion. And you're rapidly, now we're starting to see the airiness, now we're starting to see the size and proportion when you start to compare up top here and what we have up in these wilder regions to where we're headed here, you start to recognize, okay, right? Now, naturally, we're saying, hey, listen, if you pinch, just like with the hinoki, any frond-like growth, it's going to start to produce more of a ball, more of a dense, round, sort of less controlled, less organic form to that frond-like branch. And in that, it does feel like it jeopardizes aesthetic, but I'm taking a fairly, I would say, aggressive action in the pruning process here. And you should be asking yourself, what do we then expect via this pruning process to establish aesthetically? And that's really where we need to kind of dive in next, because we recognize that in any one of these fronds, I have the ability to prune back into here. And even on these tertiary pieces here, I can shorten these and I have a lot of control over how that frond looks. Now, I'm always going to go ahead and say directional pruning is always going to be your best friend to have that lateral layout. But in terms of continuing that process, do I want to try and micromanage here? That all depends on the size of the tree now. And this is really where Thuja plicata does have the capacity, although it's not as fine as, say, a Chamaecyparis obtusa nana grisalis or something where we're dealing with a dwarf form of the hinoki. Okay, it does have the ability to accommodate smaller scales, smaller sizes of bonsai based on the fact that we can go ahead and work into those much, much smaller versions and tertiary components of the frond, right? And when we start to see that, that opens the door to the ability to have a lot of control. But when we deal with a bigger tree, we need to understand that that kind of control, that kind of dictatorial opportunity to manipulate the aesthetic of the tree, do you want that? Do you want that kind of tightness? Do you want that kind of control? Do you want that kind of aesthetic that's generated, that kind of much more highly controlled form? And I would say if you're using Thuja plicata, and not every Thuja plicata is going to give you the opportunity to create a really beautiful natural reflection of Thuja plicata, right? But this particular piece definitely did give us that opportunity, especially when we think about, man, going up to the Olympics and seeing the Thuja plicata growing in their native environment at really, really historic levels of age being reached by those trees up there. The biggest, the oldest in the world, the grand champion Thuja plicatas of the Olympic Peninsula, really interesting trees to witness in person. And you recognize, well, they're not all ramrod straight. Deadwood is a very big component of them. And in fact, this tree has a lot of merits of an ancient representation of a Thuja plicata. Cool. But what happens if we're dealing with a Thuja plicata that's a little bit more nursery stock, that we have to pull the interest out of, that doesn't have the natural reflection of Thuja plicata, that might be better when considered as a bonsai subject? Well, that's when I think we probably start to talk a little bit more about having the capacity or choosing to take that opportunity to more closely manipulate and control, to be a little bit more dictatorial and tight in the shape that you give it, so that those pieces of material that don't naturally lend themselves to being a really super stellar representation of the species in its natural form, natural behavior, etc., still have the generation of design merit and the generation of artistic merit to be appreciated as a bonsai subject. And I think having those cutoff points for yourself, like where do I make the decision that I'm going to go ahead and I am going to heavily manage this species that has the ability to represent a different growth habit that is quite natural or is quite contrived and tight. When we start to choose to represent the natural, or when we start to choose to represent the more bonsai accepted form. And again, the material really leads the dance, and the material really guides the process. But look at the air and notice how spacious this is, and notice just how much we're able to really reduce the presence of all of that foliar mass. And again, you might be saying, well, you said we weren't going to be removing a heavy quantity of foliar mass in the summer season. This is not big, heavy branch reduction. This is not a radical restyling. This is just a redirection of energy for an apically dominant tree, and for a Thuja plicata, this is absolutely acceptable. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to zoom in close here, because this is one of those moments where I was talking about earlier, where you say, okay, right? Standard practice is to take out that crotch growth right there. Standard practice would be to remove that and save this branch. But when I start to look at this branch, I'm noticing that the interior of this branch is showing a slight degree of weakening. We're working hard to reduce the expanse of the foliar mass so that we maintain the proportion, and this trunk does continue to have aesthetic merit. This is one of those moments where I'm very happy to give rise to and give priority to that tinier, smaller, finer branch that's going to be a better piece of ramification over the course of time, and go ahead and take out that more leggy frond to give myself future capacities to compact. Okay? Now when I set this, whether this is the defining branch or not, and I haven't honestly looked, let me take a look at that. I feel like it is. I feel like it is. That's where I want to start, at least at the lowest point, to start to dictate that length. Now I have to respond, right? And this becomes that consistency of the design process. And there's a few more pieces that I'm going to show you through this in terms of management of the foliar mass and management characteristics of spiking foliage versus frond-like foliage. Okay, so bear with me as we kind of work through these pieces. Okay, but once I create this density, this branch structure, this airiness, this is what I have to now consistently carry through the rest of the execution of this pruning process. And this is a really good moment right here where we can see the differentiation of the growth habits. Okay, because as Thuja plicata starts to amass strength, you're going to get these singular rope-like pieces that have very little. Now notice the frond right here. We have a frond down here. So you have two pieces of ramification, and all of a sudden this says, oh, I'm growing vertically and nothing is stopping me. Cool, let's party. And it stops ramifying, and this is the elongating growth. That's that rope-like foliar mass. When we are refining, that almost inevitably has to come off just as a maintenance and a checkpoint for strength. Okay? Now maybe we look at this entire thing and we say, gosh, that's an awfully beautiful ramified piece that's super healthy, and maybe this piece right next to it is feeling a little anemic and not really, yeah, and see that? It's real delicate again. Those fronds are kind of falling apart on their own without our action. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this opportunity to take that very healthy, that very vigorous, that really, really new, nice, fresh piece of growth. I'm just going to transition this wire, and this becomes a part of this working, and the reason that we only do this once a year is because if we did this kind of working earlier, we certainly could have, and it would not be a detriment to the tree. But there is a strong chance that it would be inclined to grow again based on that transition of energy at a point where it still is in a major period of foliar productivity, whereas if we wait a little bit longer, we kind of watch that point, make sure we're not getting to that third-year needle drop yet, right? And for us, again, that kind of tends to happen towards the end of August, beginning of September. If we don't get into that point, we're able to manage that timing and mechanism of the pruning process, then we can go ahead and do this one time in a season and have it hold the shape and distribution, and it makes Thuja plicata one of our lower maintenance species in terms of what we have to do on an annual basis to preserve the distribution of strength, to enhance the refinability of the species, and really to have it contribute as a specimen in the garden. And I think having higher maintenance species and lower maintenance species intermixed, they both have their merits for those of us that are bonsai doers, as opposed to, say, more of a bonsai appreciator. You know, the Thuja plicata is a tree that we can do more on, but we start to talk more about a black pine. We start to talk more about junipers as being those species, and Thuja plicata having the capacity to be less of a doing species and more of an appreciating species. But having those distributed so that we don't get overwhelmed and we're able to give each tree kind of the attention and the priority that it deserves is a really important part of maintaining an eclectic, diversified, right, if you will, a 5-course meal as opposed to sort of a singular slab of meat. You've got your hors d'oeuvre, you've got your first course, second course. You have a salad somewhere mixed in, some breads and grains, you've got a meat or a fish or something like that, and then you have a little dessert. This is a well-rounded bonsai collection. When you start to talk about not becoming complacent or even, almost got myself, but not quite, complacent or tired, fatigued of the trees that you have around you. Having that diversity is important. And for us at Mirai, I think Thuja plicata has been that species where it's been like, oh, we actually, yeah, no, this is good. We've got a couple of them on the benches now. I would love a couple more. Just to be able to explore their breadth of aesthetic opportunity, but also recognizing that they just simply don't take nearly as much work. Now I'm going to let you in on one more little piece here of the timing for this pruning right now, and in terms of, because you might be saying, well, okay, you're doing this now. What about waiting later? You've talked about what happens earlier. We might get another push of foliar mass. We're walking that line, trying to strike that balance to touch this in let's say, as few a number of times as possible in the season so we can enjoy it, so it can be one of those lower maintenance varieties. What about if we wait beyond this? What if we wait till that 3rd year needle drop, okay? And that's a big question, because if you wait till that 3rd year needle drop, we're gonna lose some of the interiors, right? Now we're talking about the weaker pieces kind of coming off naturally at this moment, and we're not cutting back to those. We're doing a little bit of a solidarity check on the foliar mass as we're pruning right now. And if it's already coming off, right, if we reach in here and we're kind of giving these just a little bit of a pressure check and they're not coming off, then I know they still have a viable tip, okay? And I can clean off the ones I don't want. I can aesthetically manipulate them to improve, but we recognize we're cutting back to viable tissue that has the capacity to continue to ramify and grow, and that is going to enhance the shape over the course of time. Cool, got it. Okay, what if we wait? We wait till it starts to drop its 3rd year needles. We leave some of this on. Okay, we have less to cut back to. But beyond that, we're going to allow those spikes to really start to elongate, especially when we start to tap into. And when we think about Thuja, Thuja loves. This tree has been in full sun. It's been through 100-degree days already this year, and it looks fantastic. Slightly yellower, which we would expect in a bonsai container, even though it can tolerate it. It's got a very rigid cuticle, much, much more rigid than the Thuja occidentalis, the eastern white cedar. It's not as feathery. It's not as soft. The plicata is a very, very durable, heat-tolerant, slightly drought-tolerant in a bonsai container, and relatively tough species of plant. If we leave all of that on, what ends up happening is it becomes now counterproductive, because the expansive foliar mass that exists on this is going to cause rapid thickening and rapid productivity of the vascular tissue, okay? So we're pruning here a little bit later to avoid a massive productivity of new growth, so we can get away with 1 pruning a year. We're pruning here now to avoid the massive onset of vascular tissue based on that foliar load, which would cause us to have to unwire and rewire much more frequently over the course of this tree's life, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 years. The longer that we leave this foliar mass on, sort of past this midsummer pruning period of time, the greater the vascular tissue is going to form, the more the wire is going to bite in, and the more maintenance this entire scope of work becomes. So we're hitting the sweet spot, and you will want to recognize that there are opportunities with every species that we work with in bonsai where you can do the work. I can work on this tree right now. I can prune a juniper right now. I can wire this right now. I can pinch this right now. Should I? Should I? Has to become the next question. Although I can, should I? And when we start to look at the nuances of if I do it now, the timing is going to cause a massive kick out of foliar mass, right? Or if I do it now, or wait, if I wait beyond now, I'm going to have to rewire this tree, unwire and rewire it several more times than if I'm timing that pruning to be able to dictate and really control that productivity of that vascular tissue. And this, I think, is an untapped and undiscussed portion of bonsai practice from the perspective of how do you make your wire last? How do you maintain a tree in refinement? And what goes into that? We talk about fertilization. We talk about the management of growth. We talk about, hopefully, the decreasing function of wire in that process. Very rarely do we talk about timing for pruning that allows us to hit those really nuanced moments in that tree's cycle of development or cycle of growth over the course of the year to preserve the function of the wire as well as to reduce the number of times that we have to handle that. And there's always a theme beyond just Thuja plicata, because let's be really honest, there's not a lot of you out there that have Thuja plicata in your collections. Like, I know that. I know that Thuja plicata is an underutilized species. But Thuja plicata and Thuja in general has this nuance. Bonsai in general, though, what is broadly applicable to bonsai in general? The conceptual way of thinking about the art form, the actions that we take, the timing, the aesthetic, these are all broadly applicable because they do create concepts that you can take to your other trees and start to think about. What does that look like for a juniper? What does that look like for a California juniper? What does that look like for a Sabina juniper? What does that look like for a spruce? When should you be pruning a spruce, right? There's moments throughout the year where we can. Should you, right? Can versus should depends on what we're trying to accomplish with that growth. And we always say, hey, listen, every action that we perform in bonsai, we've got to be asking ourselves, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to accomplish? What in the world are you trying to accomplish? Why are you doing this beyond just the dogma, beyond just the accepted timing or the accepted what you've been taught? Elevate that bonsai practice and get into what am I trying to accomplish, because it will change dogmatic responses, it will change calendared timings of operations, and it will enhance your ability to be able to manipulate that piece in a way that maybe gives rise to a better aesthetic, a more maintainable bonsai practice, et cetera, right? These are the beautiful moments that exist inside of the expansion of our knowledge. Okay, now, and let's just take this a step farther, because there is going to be a question. Okay, cool. I have a Thuja plicata, and, or a Thuja species of any type. You're pruning right now. You're pruning for maintenance. If I have a tree that is a nursery stock Thuja, do I want to be doing big heavy branch reduction right now? Do I want to be wiring and styling? Is this a good season to wire and style? And I would say be very careful at this point in time. Be very careful with big work, right? When we start to talk about the summertime, without the addition of really, really outstanding aftercare, if we were to heavily reduce the foliar mass, if we were to make big branching decisions and reductions, and then we were to put this right back out where this came from in the garden, we definitely are setting this tree up to have some problems, okay? So you want to be calculated about the bigger work. And again, we will come back to the notion that, hey, number one time for big, heavy structural reduction and styling, spring prior to the movement of resources. We know we have the greatest amount of stored sugars and starches at that point in time. We also recognize that with that big influx of water coming because of those stored sugars and starches, we have a significant capacity to repair damage. That is our number one time. That will always be our number one time for almost, and I'm going to say almost because from a nuanced perspective, there are only a few trees where we would really see like a common juniper or a needle juniper, or rigida, okay? These are going to be summertime big moves. That's one of the exceptions. I would say olives tend to respond better to the heat. That would be another exception. But for the most part, when we look at almost every other species, right, and those are two exceptions, those aren't all the exceptions, but they just give rise to or help you understand where there's a nuance. For the majority of the trees that we work with, though, spring is the number one time to do big, heavy reduction of branches and a big, heavy structural styling, because we have energy positive, because there's the opportunity for them to repair damage, and because the daylight length is short. The temperatures are moderate, and we recognize that the aftercare that's going to be necessary is going to be very minimal compared to what it's going to require to do that same severity of work right now in the peak daylight length, peak heat, has the greatest degree of opportunity to negatively impact this tree when we reduce heavily the water movement or water mobility capacity through a break, through a tear, or we heavily reduce the conductive tissue through big branch removal. Okay, I'm taking a lot of foliar mass off, but I'm leaving a lot of foliar mass behind. I'm taking off big elongated fronds and replacing it with finer pieces of ramification. Now you're starting to see the shift of scale, okay? And this is beautiful because with the pruning, with the scissor work, we talk so much about repotting and these big radical angle changes. If you saw the Naka last night, you'll know that we abandoned that. Thank goodness we abandoned it. Would have been the wrong move, right? But the opportunity to do that makes us, it's exciting and it's tantalizing and it's dramatic and ooh, that's exciting. Let's talk about that, right? Or like this big heavy branch or this deadwood chainsaw carving and we're like, that's awesome. I want to talk about that. I would say consistency, right? And consistently, the thing that made Mr. Kimura great was his ability to prune. Okay, whether it was structural branch selection, like we did last night on the Naka to redesign, or whether it was scissor work to this degree, where the angle of each cut is intentional to leave behind a line that does not distract, right? I'm not just cutting across the fronds, I'm cutting at the diagonals with the fronds, okay? But also the scissor work to be able to prune for direction. And we don't value that kind of delicate, sensitive handling of our tools in the manner that they can function to the highest degree. Very simple tool the scissor is, right? This is not rocket science, okay? But what we can do with it if we're intentional about it and we're taking our technique to that higher level, and again, really working on a refinement phase of this tree means I need to be thinking on that level because I'm not coming in here hacking off all of these big branches. And even though I'm not hacking off all of these big branches, just by the nuance with which I'm using the scissor, I'm bringing about dramatic aesthetic change in this tree, the reallocation of energy, the pruning to direct the growth that's going to occur after this, the maintenance of the nuance and nature of the species, and we all of a sudden start to understand how important that scissor work is and how nuanced the levels to the game of each portion of bonsai can be to allow us to hit that higher level of aesthetic. It is fun to oscillate as a bonsai professional or as a bonsai practitioner in general, and I invite you to oscillate in this perspective between a big work, like the redesign of a historical piece, like that is the Naka. I'm wiring the pygmy cypress forest in the workshop right now. We did the Naka big structural redesign last night, and now we're doing Thuja plicata refinement pruning, you know, as this sort of midsummer perfect nuance at that tertiary level, the most minimal impact I'm gonna have on the tree in terms of a big move, but maybe the most important to understand refinement application to really continue the process of this tree getting better and better and better incrementally based on the fruits of all the labor we've put in. Pretty exciting. Pretty exciting in the most quiet, kind of meek, like, hey, I'm over here too, the little scissors. doing pruning. Pay attention to me. Think I'm cool. And I love these scissors too. These are the Joshua Roths. No, this is not a plug for Joshua Roth. Like, hey, we've been Joshua Roth, so we're gonna like buy our scissors. Like they've been doing it for a long time. We've tried a lot of tools. This scissor right here, which is actually a newer rendition of the I believe we call it the bud shear. It's definitely the smaller of the two that we offer. That little angle right there, the way that I have big hands and the way that they fit my hands, but that tip right there, the taper to that tip to have really good control, definitely don't want to be cutting wire. You definitely don't want to drop it. In fact, you don't even want to be using those tips to cut a relatively moderately sized branch. You want to use these for this type of very soft tissue work, but these are monsters in terms of their accuracy, their quality, and the experience of using them over the course of a prolonged pruning like what we're doing now is a really wonderful tool. And I don't plug tools very often, but this has been one. and when they stopped carrying the previous model that I had grown to, and I do get attached. I do get attached because you adjust. You adjust the ergonomics of your bonsai practice to the tool. You adjust some of your technical application to the tool. To be able to use the tool and maximize the tool is another technique and aspect of bonsai that again, we have to be aware of. It exists. There are different ways that different scissors are designed to be used. And if we come into this with some big, wide, broad blade or something, then making these really beautiful angled cuts and really working on the green tissue and leaving behind as little of a remnant, as little of a browning, and as refined of a product as possible for the sensitivity and delicacy of this refined work, this is a product of the tool. And so when Joshua Roth stopped carrying the tool, the scissors that we previously vended, although they had a similar shape, there was a little bit of a different nuance to the blade. We literally tested 10 or 12 different scissors before we kind of found the one in the catalog that Ken at Joshua Roth could order from the foundry. And I'm even more happy with the current iteration than the previous one. And that's when you have a really beautiful relationship, both with your tool distributor as well as with the foundry in terms of what they're offering, looking for those specifics that allow you to tap into some of that really beautiful delicacy to practice bonsai on a higher level. And you know, when I started, and even when I was a traveling professional, and Todd Schlafer's in the workshop right now, he's here, and we've been talking a little bit this morning about you know, being a traveling professional and the pandemic and stuff, and I would assume we'll probably podcast about that at some point this week. But when I was a traveling professional, I tried to travel as light as possible. It was quick and dirty. It was you know, have the lightest luggage, have the least number of tools that I have to load up, and just take the bare necessities. Well, now you're starting to talk about, and this is where I think the traveling professional model is very valuable to help us in our backyards with pieces of work that are a little bit above our head, or that we want the assistance of a professional on, or we're trying to curate a collection and really trying to gain the skills and knowledge to be able to do so. I think that's where there's a lot of function there. But when we start to talk about some more of these, I think, more nuanced scopes of work, you know, as a traveling professional, these are the kinds of things where you really have to be observing the trees in your environment, and you really do need that greater expanded toolkit, almost like a toolkit has a primary, secondary, and tertiary level to the tools that you have. And I'm not like a super fanatic about tools. I don't have a gajillion tools. I have a healthy set of tools that function for what I need, and that's the extent of it. But when I add a piece to that toolkit, it is a very, very intentional decision, because it has to. It has to function, or else it's just getting in the way and causing a greater amount of clutter. Anyways, big, huge, tangential sort of like bypass of the greater discussion of Thuja plicata to talk about some of the bonsai practice methodologies and aspects that influence. And I love this tree. The first time Dan Robinson came to Bonsai Mirai and saw this tree, he said, "It's pretty big, isn't it? Like, it's pretty wide. You have a lot of branches. Maybe, you know, this isn't how they really grow." And it was like, yeah, no, definitely. But he saw it just before the pruning, right? And then you do the pruning and you see the reduction of this and the shrinking, if you will, of the foliar masses, and you start to get this lightness and this hanging and this airiness, and all of a sudden the trunk, you know, whereas this felt like a toothpick, now it feels a little bit more like a pencil. And by the time we're done, it's going to feel a little bit more like a wrist, right? But this is a tall, elegant tree. This is an elongated design, and these big drooping branches. This is a nuance of Thuja that this piece of material allowed us to tap into. More than that, though, this midsummer pruning, a sweet spot for your timing, to be hitting it at a point where it doesn't induce a massive second flush, to be hitting it at a point in time where we can use scissors to redirect and we still can cut back to those interior actively growing forms of ramification, to hit it at a point in time where it has not yet started to amass its hit it at a point in time where it has not yet started to amass its vascular tissue, so that we prolong the function of the wire, we maintain and perpetuate the ability for that wire to set the shape without abusively causing scarring or decreasing the function of that wire in terms of its timing, right? And we really do nuance this species and turn it into a lower maintenance component of our garden that we can enjoy, that adds variety to that 5-course meal, that allows us to really appreciate the form and nuance of Thuja plicata, or Thuja in general, but allows us to do so in a sustainable way, okay? All right, that tertiary version in the midsummer and all of the timing considerations, okay? Thank you all for tuning in today. I'll go through and finish the rest of this, right? I know watching pruning for 2 hours is not the most thrilling thing, although I definitely could get into it. So it's like, you know, there's some of me that wants to keep going, but I'm gonna let you go, get back to your bonsai practice as you were, and we're gonna continue rocking at Mirai. Thanks for tuning in, thanks for the support. Bye guys.